Hi, this is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's Dispatches Conversation series. Joining us today is writer, poet, director, and my very dear friend Danish Husain. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, hi everyone. Hi Suchitra. Thank you so much for having me on this Polis Project talk, and I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, and also I'm actually really sad because we were supposed to have this great talk of yours in New York that we had curated called A Poet in Unrest, and we couldn't because of COVID lockdown. But before we go any further, how are you doing? I know that you're in kind of this self imposed exile in the US. How is your COVID lockdown going?
Well, at this moment, I can only say I'm very grateful. I'm very, you know, I'm very thankful. I'm in a much better position than most people, and it is very heartbreaking to see so many people suffer right now. And that heartbreak kind of compounds because you find invariably helpless. You really can't do much to mitigate people's suffering, except just request government agencies or try uh, reaching out to some NGOs or connecting people at best. So physically, I say I'm comfortable. I'm at my sister's place in Michigan right now. I'm safe, completely in self-isolation, but emotionally and mentally, I think these are tough times for all of us.
You've also been doing a series of poetry readings online.
Yes. The first, I would say, the first fortnight here in the US, it went like a haze because too much was unfurling and too much was unraveling. And literally, it was like we've been hit by an asteroid. But then, when it kind of dawned on me that this is going to be the more regular reality of mine, I'm stuck here. I have to spend time here, and I have no idea when I will be able to get back home because right now both India and Michigan are in lockdowns. So I thought maybe I need to structure my day around, and a couple of my friends happily kicked me on my butt. They said, "Get up, stop being your lazy self, do something." And then it occurred to me that I always love reciting poetry. I've kind of memorized a lot of poems, and I just love reciting them. And I love when the meaning and the emotion of the feeling reaches the audiences, and when they also have their aha moment when they realize, oh, this is what the poem is. That's a very satisfactory moment for me. So I thought, why not make these small 2 to 3 minute videos where I literally perform these poems, and these are poems by Urdu poets, um, and put it out to the world.
And that actually brings us to a very interesting question that one of our readers sent in. This is by Meher Manda. She says, Danish, how can poetry be a tool for justice when it's so inaccessible for so many?
And that's a very good question. Uh, to understand this question, one has to understand how commercialized and fascist kind of societies work. I mean, if you were to read the Indian socio-political atmosphere, cultural atmosphere in the 18th century, you would find that almost everybody was a polyglot. Uh, Poetry and literature and culture kind of percolated right to the lowest denominator. Um I mean, you have heard anecdotes and incidents about how people use very eloquent language in Lucknow even till date when you go there and when you speak to people. So, uh, what I would say that there was a very high oral literacy in our culture even till early 20th century. And that high oral literacy culture means that people knew by heart a lot of poetry, a lot of cultural references. They may not be very well read or highly literate in terms of writing and reading, but they were very oral literate people. And because of that, the culture was very rich. Now, what commercialization and fascism and authoritarian rule does that it kind of pulls you away from all that. It wants you to think in a very blinkered way. It wants to disassociate yourself in ways where you lose your agency. So you would find that increasingly authoritarian societies, people will lose touch with culture, with literature, with poetry, and poetry would become inaccessible to them. But because of our long history of being orally literate country, it is it is still very much alive in our country. People still respond to poetry even today, when I think we have the worst parliamentarians that we've seen in 70 years. Still, people, when they get down to the floor, they are quoting poetry to buttress their argument. There's still sloganeering happening, and poetry doesn't really mean that uh, it has to be really, really literate and have high literary register, but also simple poetry, like when people are trying to rhyme something, or people are trying to use words cleverly, or they're trying to pun on something, and that happens a lot. And the reason we can say that poetry is still alive and effective, that when in the past 3 4 months, when we had the anti-CAA and NRC and NPR protests, poetry just flourished and it came alive, and we not just established and reputed poets and writers were writing, even common people were writing poetry, and they were posting it there on their social media, or performing that wherever they could go in a protest and could get a platform, and it was resonating with people. So and also the reason why poetry is effective, because poetry as such in itself has the ability to distill human emotions and present them in the most eloquent way to people, so that it immediately resounds and it immediately appeals to people. And thus, sometimes the best things can be said in a shade or in a couplet or in a poem, whereas it would take a speech for you to say something like that effectively, but a poem can just very well effectively convey all that emotion. So I think Meher, poetry is very much alive. It's effective, and like I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said a lot of words that the poems that I recite, the words are tough. And I said a conversation is only complete when both the people present in the conversation are involved in it. If I'm writing poetry and you're not making an effort to find out what that poem is, then that poem will always be lost. So it will be nice if people who are getting moved by poetry also make an effort to dive further and to read and to understand these poems, basically imbibe these poems so that they become a part of them. And they would I found it personally, that when in my dark days, when I was very depressed and down and out, one of the records I took by keeping my sanity intact was to memorize a lot of poems, and it was very handy. It enriched my language, it enriched my thought process, and I just found that when I'm out there dealing with the world, I'm more equipped because I know more poetry.
And I want to kind of pick on the two of the threads that you spoke about. One thing is that of, I think we've spoken about this very briefly, about how Urdu itself now kind of flourished in these CAA protests, that people were reciting Urdu poetry. Urdu, which had been marginalized as a state language, and somehow flourished. But you also had the Mia poets of Assam, who wrote these incredible poetry, who were again charged, as poets, they were charged with sedition for writing poetry. And of course, there are young poets like Hussein Haidri who've been performing, who was here in New York performing. And the moment they perform, there's this sense of, it feels like somebody just kicked you in your gut. The reaction is very visceral. I was wondering if you can talk about this moment in which of great liberation that happened during the CAA protests, but also it led to this moment of great fear and danger, because the state was also simultaneously cracking down on even poets for writing poetry.
Well, I think uh, we both are aware, and it is a common knowledge, that authoritarian regimes are very, very scared of intellectuals and poet. Uh, they would rather be dealing with mindless, senseless people doing violence on street, rather than intellectuals or writers whose words are sharp enough to kind of poke holes in their authoritarian regimes. So poets and writers and intellectuals have always been threat. And what has happened to Mia poets in Assam is no different than that, because Mia poets suddenly give a voice to all those faceless people who are living there with the threat that their citizenship or their basic humanity may be stolen from them or appropriated from them. And Mia poets just make them very human. They not only they make them human, they make them literate, they make them highly cultured, they basically equip them with history, with voice, with culture, with poetry, and that is too much to deal for any authoritarian regime. They cannot deal with that. So it is a very natural step that they were charged with sedition, and it's a very natural step that they were persecuted. And similarly, like poets like Hussain Hedri or Varun Grover or Amir Aziz, why their poetry sounds very visceral, because it is coming from a very visceral place. It is a very gut kind of a literary response to what is happening around us, and that's the reason. When you hear their poetry, it is. You feel that kick in your gut because they have literally given voice to that violent feeling of being oppressed, of being helpless, of being not able to do anything, of being silenced, of being marginalized, of being told to shut up and stay in your corner, of being told that you are no good, you are an anti-national, you are basically not contributing to the society, you're only criticizing. So all that suppressed get voiced in these poets' poetry, and suddenly it becomes a tool for everybody. Suddenly everybody is reciting these poems because that's the only way they can put across what they're feeling, and it becomes like, okay, I'm mute. I cannot speak. I am not eloquent enough to express my emotions, but here is a person who has done it, and it resonates what I'm feeling, and thus I will recite this poetry. And that's why I think, I mean, people have this very uh, aesthete notion that poetry should be beautiful and it should be about love and it should be about clean surroundings and hygiene places and people well dressed and glamorous looking and falling in love with each other. But of course, it's not like that. I mean, poetry is for everything. Like Nazir Akbarabadi was writing poetry on on cucumber, on laddu, on watermelon.
How do
Uh,
you write? How do you write poetry on laddu?
you well, to Nazir Akbarabadi, and they were poems which were like fun poems, but they were highly literary poems. So so it is really the
No, no, I'm,
poets
I'm
in.
not. I'm not being facetious. It's just it was. I think that moment when you said it, it is this.
When he wrote 200 years back poetry, or 250 years back, when he wrote poetry on cucumber and lattu, everybody else thought that he was very facetious, and how can anyone malign poetry like this by bringing it down to such bleak levels? He did it, and he did it with such elan and with such style. So mm, I think poetry, essentially, even if it is about love, and even if it is about something very aesthetic, it is visceral. I mean, when it says दिल से मिटना तेरी अंगुश्त हिनाई का ख्याल हो गया गोश्त से नाखून का जुदा हो जाना. Basically, uh, the thought of erasing your henna fingered from my heart was almost like pulling nail from my fingers. So that's very visceral. This the imagery of somebody's nails being pulled out is very visceral, and yet it talks about deep love. So I think every poetry is visceral. Eventually, every good poetry is visceral.
So that brings us to a more lighter conversation. We have Carol, who's asked us about a question from your new Netflix special, where she says, "What is your favorite aspect of Sudhakar and Mumtaz's relationship?" For those who don't know, would you want to tell us about this wonderful little film that you're a part of? And I say little not in terms of its ambitions, but in terms of its dignity and beauty. And tell us about your favorite aspect of Sudhakar and Mumtaz's relationship. And the person who sent it to us is Carol.
Okay, hi Carol. So, those who are not aware what we are talking about, it is this latest Netflix series that I acted in. It's called Taj Mahal 1989. It's still on Netflix. You can go and watch it as part of your quarantine and self-isolation. This the series came to me as uh, I must say I was very fortunate to get it. I was I was shooting for another film, for Baba Azmi's film called Mir Aksam. It hasn't been released yet, and I was in a village in UP where the network was very bad. And suddenly one day I get a call from a casting director that there is this lovely role in a new series, and I really want you to test for it. But the only way the test could happen was that I do a self-test because I'm far away, so they can't come over and test me and audition me. So I do a self-test and send a video, and I said, "Look, I am in a village in UP. Here, it's literally, it's I don't know how I can ever send you and broadcast you that video." So, but they patiently waited for me to arrive in a bigger city a week later, where I recorded the audition and I sent it to them. And then I went and I met Pushpendra Mishra, who's the writer and the director of the series. And I had no idea. I mean, from the audition scenes, I could figure out that this is a very layered character because one audition scene involved me speaking in Urdu and English and talk about Nietzsche and the concept of Ubermensch. And the other scene in the audition uh, had me speaking Awadhi, like really hardcore Awadhi. So I knew that this is a very layered character who can speak Awadhi and Urdu and English and can talk about Nietzsche and Ubermensch concept. So I was excited. But when I went to Pushpendra Mishra and when he met me and when he recited the story and what the whole thing was, I was completely drawn in. I was completely taken by the whole concept and how these four stories are entwined, and I just fell in love with my character. It is such an aspirational character. I mean, the man is Zen-like in the film. I would like to be Zen-like him. He's a and Zen not in the way that he's detached. He's very attached. He's very involved. He's in the moment. He loves. He gets angry. He banters with his friend, and yet there is a certain amount of detachment that he has. He is like he's taking a laid back, zoomed out, a bird's eye kind of a view of what is happening, and that is phenomenal. To be in a moment and to have a bird's eye view of the moment is perhaps very aspirational for most of us. So
But I
I
also feel that you also become like that. I remember our conversations in 2014 and 15, and it was an incredibly difficult period for all of us. But since then, now I see you 5 years after. In some ways, I
Mhm.
wonder if you've also cultivated that sense of being in the moment and also kind of stepping back a bit. I also see that in you quite a bit, the sense of wanting to do both. I kind of wonder if it's also this character made so much sense because you were also some ways, as I was seeing it on the screen, I just kept thinking there's also so much of you in that character.
Oh, but if you would say that, then they would stereotype. They would only give me I'm Zen, like I in some series. But yeah, yes, to come back to your point, I mean, uh, I think as we start getting older, um, a lot of realizations start coming in. We start realizing that we spend our youth stuck up with things that really shouldn't matter that much. There's a lot of idealism. There's a lot of um, to use your word again, a lot of visceral emotionalism, like really getting glued to things and believing in binaries and believing that the world should only be this way and no other way, and there is very less room for opposition or for a more layered or a more spectrum kind of a view. And I think all these notions start diluting as you start getting older. You start realizing uh, your place in the universe and how like that famous गालिब नज्म की चलिए अब रहिए अब चलकर ऐसी जगह जहाँ हम ज़बां कोई ना हो. So, or like Habib Saab's Nazm, where he says that, I'm forgetting that, something like where he says that let's go to the jungle after giving up everything. And when you read these poems now, when I read these poems in my 20s and in my 30s, they were just some kind of romantic music of a man who wants to give up the world and go and stay in isolation. But now when I read these poems, they just have a different meaning to them. Where it's more about reducing your carbon footprint. It's more about not being a burden on other people. It's more about being as less inconvenience to others as you can. And I think these things start dawning as we start getting older. And I think perhaps Sudhakar Mishra's character kind of got it very early than all of us. And that's what the beauty of that character is. And that's why when Pushpendra asked me to do that role, I was so happy. Finally, nobody wants me to play a Taliban head or a
Then we still have to answer the question: what is your favorite aspect of Sudhakar's and Mumtaz's relationship? That was the part of the Carol's question.
I think the banter that the two do is lovely. It's a banter which is kind of very gender equal in the sense that sometimes she has an upper hand, sometimes I have an upper hand, and it's a banter which does not condescend on the other person. It's a banter which, like I used to say when Begum Akhtar used to make joke of somebody, whoever the person on whom the joke was, and the joke, and whoever the person was who was listening to the joke, they both would be enriched by it, and they both would be enthused by it. So I think that was the great thing about the banter between Sudhakar Mishra and Mumtaz's relationship, that it was a very equal relationship where sometimes one character would have an upper hand, sometimes the other, and and each time it happened, it just made the relationship even more beautiful than what it was. It just kind of touched audiences. It's like it's like the way we are when in love, you know. We just feed on each other and feed on in a very healthy, prosperous way.
Somebody recently on Twitter said you are the new Radhika Apte of Netflix, which I found was very funny. But I wanted to go back to this question that I've been wanting to ask you.
Hmm.
You also kind of alluded to it a bit about you are still Danish Husain, you can speak in multiple languages, but Danish Husain is still an Indian Muslim man. Do you get
Hmm.
typecast into roles where you're still asked to play the terrorist, asked to play these specific roles? Is that a problem that you faced? Are you still struggling with this identity? Is that still something that you're struggling with? I would love to hear from you. Um,
Mm, Well, I no, I mean in the sense that how should I say? I cannot make a blanket statement like that, but I can say that a couple of times when I got approached for international projects, and especially after I did Bar of Blood series for Netflix, where I'm playing the head of Taliban and a very dreaded terrorist. The roles were where I again had to play some terrorist, and I was very disappointed. That was like really typecast. It didn't work out. Uh, One didn't work out because I was traveling to America and my shoot dates were coinciding with that. So it was not working out for both of us, and the other project never happened. But I'm quite relieved for that. But then that's not the only typecast. Like that's a struggle which character artists face in India. I mean, people who are not playing the hero as the conventional understanding in Bollywood is. Uh, so you start getting these very like heroine's father and like hero's brother or uncle or some kind of a benevolent avuncular character who's there, and that can be pretty disheartening because it is very unidimensional. So like um, I'm playing in Miraksum and Baba Asmi's film a very caring father for a daughter who wants to learn Bharatanatyam. Uh, and again in Ye Ballet, in Sunit Arporwala's film, I'm acting as again a father who is willing to support his son who wants to learn ballet. And then again, I had another offer in a film where I have a daughter who wants to be a band member, and I have to play this benevolent father. And I said, no, I cannot be for the third time. Daughter is a jazz opera R&B singer, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to be having my real life playing on reel all the time. So these are the kind of dangers of being typecasted in our industry, that you may end up doing similar kind of roles, and then that becomes very because casting directors and people only start seeing you in that kind of role, and which is something that I want to avoid. So after Bard of Blood, when Taj Mahal 1989 came, it was a great relief for me because they are diametrically opposite characters. Mullah Khalid and Sudhakar Mishra are like two different
Mm-hmm.
worlds. So I was very, very relieved to play something like that where I'm not really being typecasted and I'm not playing a similar kind of a character. And I think that is the thing. You have to catch filmmakers' imagination. If you keep playing similar kind of characters, then filmmakers do not see outside of you. You do not see you outside of that. And I've seen that with many actor friends of mine who, being brilliant, have not been able to get that kind of opportunity because they are seen in a particular kind of character. Like when I was reading Habib Tanvir's biography, he said that it is really sad that the Indian film industry or the Indian audiences have not seen Balraj Sahani play a comical role, because he was the most hilarious actor on the stage. And it was so heartbreaking when I read that, because Balraj Sahani died in 1972, 73, and now there is nothing now there is no way we can see him play a comical role. And whatever stage performances he did, I doubt anyone was ever recorded. I mean, if ever somebody comes out with some tape and says, here is a live performance of Balraj Sahani lying in some attic or in some basement of mine, I would be thrilled like nothing. But it's a sad fact that Balraj Sahani always played a sober role, always played a role where he had to lose his heart eventually, where he was heartbroken, and we would never get to know what a great comical actor he was. So I want to avoid that. Well, I may not be Balraj Sahani, and I may not be great, and I may not be a brilliant actor, but at least I'm seen as an actor who's done all kind of roles.
So we have another audience question. This is from someone called Solhas. I don't know if that's even a real name, but it's from Solhas,
First of
and
all, lives in
um,
Bombay,
the
often
question:
comes from performances there.
how was your sorry, okay, what was your childhood like?
My childhood was, I think if you really, I'm not a very eloquent man, and it would take long to describe what my childhood was. But if you really want to understand what my childhood was, you should read Edward Said's Out of Place. And when I read Edward Said's autobiography and Out of Place, I was like, wow, what he's writing is exactly what I felt when I was a child. And in fact, in Edward Said's Out of Place book autobiography, there's a photograph where he's standing with his sister. And I have exactly the same photograph with my sister in the same pose. When I looked at that photograph, I was like, oh man. So it was essentially a childhood where it was a protected childhood. It was a happy childhood. But it was also a childhood where we were kind of living at the generosity of much, wealthier and prosperous cousins. We were sharing spaces with them, and that sense of this is not completely yours, but you are the second in terms of the ownership, or you are living because somebody is kind enough to share the space with you. That sense was always there with me, which always made me feel out of place. And then my sister was very beautiful, so everybody thought I was the ugly duckling of the family. And she was not just smarter; she was just better in everything, in studies and presentation and conversations and her looks. So So my problems got compounded. I was feeling marginalized, and I was feeling even more marginalized within the nuclear unit that I was living in. Uh,
I think we
so
all suffer with having siblings who are far smarter, eloquent, and better than us. So I empathize with you.
so I think it was, in some sense, a mixed kind of a childhood, where I was enriched by the people who were around me, because my house, my extended family was a family of poets and academics and scholars. So I always had like really high literary conversations and religious discourses happening at my home. I mean, the kind of language people used in my house, it took me a long time to understand that this is very unusual, and it happens in my household only. People would quote Persian couplets and Urdu couplets and historical references, and talk about writers and authors you don't even know of. I remember I had an uncle who used to live in London, and my dad, they were like besties. And when my uncle would come from London to India, post dinner, we would have these bedbuzzies, where basically a competition in poetry, where my uncle and my dad would sit together and they would throw couplets at each other, vis-a-vis a theme. And they would keep throwing couplets at each other till one of the person runs out of couplets on that particular theme. And
How
then they
long
would.
did it take for them to run out of couplets? A few hours?
But no, not really. I mean, it'll go on till 20, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then they would switch to another theme, and then they would start throwing. So it was like, like a tennis match happening. Okay, one set is mine. I got more couplets on this theme, and then they would move to the next set, and then, oh, I've got more couplets on this theme, and the match would go on till literally wee hours. And we will be just amazed and dumbstruck and wide-eyed sitting there and hearing these people. And the great part was that not only they quoted great poets, they quoted poets nobody knew of. And suddenly, like, my uncle would quote something, my dad would sit up and say, "Who the hell is that guy?" And he said, "Oh, this is this new poet I've discovered." And then my dad would throw a couplet, and my uncle would sit up and say, "I've never heard this guy." And my dad would say, "I have discovered this new poet." And it's remarkable that these two gentlemen were not really poets in their own right. I mean, they had written some poetry here or there, but they had no claim as poets. But the amount of literature they knew by heart, it was incredible. So I think I was very enriched by this kind of a culture. And and yes, like all of us, I grew up, and like all of us, I grew up imperfect, and like all of us, I grew up lost, and I grew up like all of us, bit naive, and bit greedy, and bit self-centered, and bit willing to give it all to everybody.
And then you decided to leave a career as an economist to become an actor.
Yeah, but I was never meant to be an economist or in the first place. Literally, I was so mediocre and I was such a dud. I did whatever was offered to me, and I just kept marching on with that because I didn't have the imagination to do something else. And it literally took me some, 28, 29 years of my life to realize that this is not what I want to do. And maybe I should use my imagination and figure out what else I want to do. So yes, in that sense, I was a late bloomer. I was 32 when I resigned from my banking career and decided to be an actor. By the time people are superstars.
Well, I think many would say that you're also, in some ways, a superstar. But more importantly, I think you're also a wonderful friend. So I should thank you for that as well. We
Thank
have
you
an. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
for being a friend too, Suchitra.
We have a couple of questions from Simi Isaac. I'm going to pick one since we're kind of already well past our slot and we have few more questions.
You kidding?
Huh?
Spoken that much?
Sorry?
Yeah, that much?
Yeah, we're already on like I think 40 minutes now, almost 40, I think.
Oh, I thought there will be nothing much to talk.
We always end up having long conversations when we talk, so I've never had problems with that.
Hmm.
This is what Simi Isaac has. Simi Isaac asks, in the 80s, the AT&T commercial "Reach out and touch someone" could not be more apropos in this age. Are we truly using all our technologies to reach out to those in our immediate sphere of impact, as well as to vulnerable populations such as elderly and infirm?
Hmm.
That's the question. She's asking if we are using all the technologies that we have to reach out to the most vulnerable in society.
Well, What can I say, Simi? Yes, I mean, that tagline of that ad is like literally a spear going through your heart in these times, where literally social distancing has ensured that you cannot even touch your very intimate, companions without some shred of suspect or hygiene or doubt that we need to clean off. So yes, we live in unprecedented times. We live in a times of pandemic, which the world has not seen before. If it has seen before, yes, we had the Spanish flu and influenza and malaria and plague and all that in past. But what is different now is that technology was not there. So the movement of people, rapid movement of people, rapid movement of information, that was not there, and which is now, which is making this pandemic such a big threat, and that's why lockdowns are happening all over the world. I think what will happen is that I, I mean, I don't know. I'm not some futurist. I'm not some soothsayer, and I'm not really a great social scientist or a psychologist or an observer of human, behavior. But yes, I'm an actor, and I do observe, and I sense that the COVID-19 virus would, in some sense, fundamentally alter a lot of our societal relationship when it gets over. We don't know whether 6 months from now, whether 1.5 years from now, whether 2 years from now, before we can limp back to some kind of normalcy. But I think whenever we limp back to normalcy, we would have fundamentally changed as a world. Um, and two things which kind of stuck out to me, which kind of stare at me throughout this whole pandemic scenario. One is the hypocrisy of religion. I think nothing has been exposed more than religion. That really this whole ritualistic, religious kind of societal being that we are, it has been completely exposed. What we really need is investment in science, in health, and infrastructure, in knowledge, and really, religion is really the most regressive thing which we have, and which is impeding everything towards the welfare of human beings. And the other thing which has really gotten exposed is the broken capitalist system. I mean, we cannot afford to have a system which ignores very universal basic rights, which is health, which is food, which is shelter, which is education. And I think any system which is taking you away from these universal rights is a broken system. And that broken system has been exposed in this pandemic virus. So we, whatever societies we emerge into post COVID-19 pandemic, that society will have to address these things. We will have to, I mean, I'm not saying that one should become communist or one should become socialist, but certainly the capitalist model and certainly the American capitalist model is really not working. It is very, very broken, and it is there staring in our face while being the richest and the most powerful country. People are so helpless in the face of this pandemic virus. PPEs are not available. Hospitals, literally, if you're not suffering from COVID-19, are turning you away, no matter how serious your illness be, and it is really heartbreaking. So I think even systems like Italy and Germany and France, who have a very good welfare system, are literally struggling to fight with this pandemic virus. Just think what would happen in India and other, African and Middle Eastern, South Asian and Southeast Asian countries where systems are really, really broken. So I think these two things are going to change. At a personal level, I think we will cringe now when we will see in cinema people hugging and kissing and shaking hands. I think a lot of our personal hygiene and etiquette behavior would change. We would wash hands more. We would stop hugging and shaking hands with people unless we're very, very close to somebody and we know for sure that this person has been equally maintaining the same hygiene standards as us. We're not going to be physically intimate with people. Um, I think physical dating would like really crash as a market. Uh,
Okay, okay, I'm going to stop you now. I don't think humans are going to stop hugging. I think dating will actually flourish. I hope actually people don't look at the screen and
Activity would kind of increase because you're safe in a virtual space. Um, think solo performances will increase because, especially in the lockdown period, because in lockdown period, people can't meet each other and can't collaborate, and technology is really not so good that it can sync live feed from various people together to make it a collaborative performance. So there will be a rise in solo
Are
performances.
you saying that you're going to perform a monologue for us from Othello? Is that what's happening? Are you preparing us for us?
I mean, yes, why not? You will find, I mean, Patrick Stewart is reading out sonnets every
Mm-hmm.
day on his Instagram feed and on his Twitter feed. So a lot of solo performances will happen. And also, what will happen is that what people, normal people who are not entertainers or performers, they had outsourced entertainment in the sense that they were getting entertainment from Netflix and from Amazon Prime and from television and from live performances. But now, because they can't go out and they can't do much, and because also performers and people who are entertainers are really also locked down and can't
Mm-hmm.
create much, people might themselves start moving towards content creation, and we might see audiences themselves becoming performers and creating content and putting it out. A lot of it might be amateurish, but a lot of it might be professional.
And as we come to the end of our conversation, Loading Shortly has a question for you. It says, is isolation even feasible in poverty stricken countries? This resonated a lot with what we saw in India, with hundreds of thousands of migrant laborers walking from Delhi towards UP and Bihar. I was wondering if, watching that from exile, sitting here, if you could tell me your own thoughts on this.
Yeah, isolation could have been possible in countries like India if only we would have had an empathetic state, a state which would have constantly worked and tirelessly worked for 70 years for the welfare of people. If we had a bureaucracy which was not corrupt, if we had people with general attitude of being empathetic towards their neighbors and their fellow human beings, we perhaps would have been able to manage with this crisis much better. But we, as a society, have become apathetic, we have become greedy, we have corrupt structure where whether it's bureaucracy or whether it's the executive or whether it's a judiciary. So it's a broken system, and that's why people are suffering in these places. I don't think India's crisis, even now, is unmanageable, but it requires a great, great change of basically, human behavior, which is there in that country. People need to agree and accept some baseline morality, some baseline values, some baseline attitude, and some baseline behavior. They need to come and agree on that, and then from there we can push forward, and then possibly we can achieve and we can manage this pandemic. So it is possible, but it requires a certain will, it requires a certain introspection, and it requires a huge, huge ability to look into the mirror and says, "This is what it is."
Uh, Last question, and I think this is a really important question, and we'll finish with that. This is again from Simi Isaac. Simi asks, I've been constantly asked that this is the time to follow directions of the government, even though dissent should continue. I think she's speaking in terms of the CAA protests versus lockdown. What else can we do at this point but do what the government says? I think she's raising important questions, something that many of us have been grappling with. Um, India has to protest against the CAA and the NRC and a series of other rights violations. And yet, we are all under this lockdown, badly organized lockdown in India. So, how do we reconcile these two between dissent and also following these social distancing norms?
Well, I think first we need to understand is that this whole value of this whole negative value that has been attributed to dissent, that has to go away.
Mm-hmm.
Dissent is not a negative. Dissent is not a social bad that it should not be there. That's a problem. People are viewing dissent as a social bad thing. It's not a social bad thing. Yes, in a time of crisis and in a time of war, you need to have a very decisive leadership at the top, and you need to kind of give away some of your liberties so that coordination and management can be better. But that does not mean that you give away your right to criticize. That does not mean that if the government agencies or if people who are in charge of relief work are not doing it well, then one should not criticize that. And I think that should be understood. Dissent does not mean disruption. Dissent does not mean that, oh, I'm not going to let you do your work. It's not that. Dissent means that if you are not going to do your work, we will criticize you. We will point out what you are not doing well, and we are doing it with the intention that you will take this feedback and possibly improve the system. That's what it is all about. So I think one needs to distinguish and differentiate between what dissent is and what disruption is.
Danish, thank you so much for joining us. Before I finish, I'm going to make two announcements. One, Danish has a wonderful book. He has a chapter in this book with Eve Ensler and others where they write about strongmen. I urge all of you to buy that book, read that book. I think the book is
Has published it. Leftword
yeah,
Books has.
Leftword, Vijay Prasad's Leftword book. And I know we also had a long conversation about this. So for those who want to listen to more about Danish's take on identity politics, writing the book, his acting career, we did a long podcast with Danish almost 2 years ago, which is available on our website. So do check that out. But more importantly, please do donate to local organizations that are on the front line working, and also tune in to see Danish perform every day on Instagram. And thank you so much. And I'm so glad you're here.
It is called A Dastango Stranded in America.
Yes.
A Dastango Stranded in America.
Dastango standard in America. We will have all those links down in our on our site as well. So Danish, thank you so much. And anytime you want to come back and have a longer conversation, please let us know.
Thank you so much, Suchitra. Thank you, the team at the Polis, and thank you all of you who patiently heard me out. I wish you all a lovely, lovely stay in your isolation. A lot of love. Do not feel down. We will be able to weather this, and let's do whatever we can to help the weakest and the most marginalized amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.